Ranged players, Midnight's came for your buttons as well. In the name of approachability, you will have lost anywhere between 2 and 5 abilities, but some of you have gotten complete reworks in that process, and what I can say for sure is that not one single spec is going to Silvermoon the same. And a little bit unlike our melee roundup, sadly for ranged, not all of them are better for it. Now then, this one's actually a wee bit different. It's about something I've been working through. So, bit past 30 now, running a business that I've been building over years, but I found myself a bit stuck. Not really on what to do, but kind of where to take things and in what order. And that's where today's sponsor, Strawberry.me, comes in. They match you with a certified career coach. Mine, Kim, has been genuinely useful. I'm actually just off a session. Now, in our first session, we worked through some of my hang-ups, actually. She helped me set long-term goals and actually build some actionable steps to get there. I mean, really to just help me feel unstuck. What I valued most was just the fresh, empathetic perspective, Things that I won't really think that are perhaps obvious to her because she's outside of my situation. She asked brilliant questions, helped me discover what sorts of things are right for me. Very much a partner in growth, not a lecture. Amazing. And if you want that kind of support, well, you can get matched at strawberry.me/Bellular. Now, sessions are virtual, they fit your schedule, and like afterwards, she sent me a full recap with action items, all the things I could need. I'm actually kind of excited to work through things for our next session so that, well, I can actually start making a lot of the changes that have just been floating around in my brain, but not really feeling practical and actionable. It's given me real relief, actually, and real help. So, if you're serious about where you're heading, you can stop guessing and you can cut through some of that uncertainty and get some help by going to strawberry.me/Bellular. If you go there, you'll get 50% off your first week. You just need to follow that link or just scan the QR code on the screen. Now is the most affordable time to find out if career coaching is the right choice for you. Bounce through it then. So with this rework, it's official. Blizzard have tried, I think, every possible way of making Eclipse work. Though the question is, will this be the one that they actually stick with? So, here's what's happening. Eclipse is actually now a button, and whether it's solar or lunar will depend on the last filler that you cast, and this time it matches instead of being the opposite. So as an example, if you were pressing Wrath, then you would hit the Eclipse button, and that would give you a buffed Wrath. Now, at first we kind of thought this was a bit weird. It was maybe just Blizzard giving up and going for a simple thing. And I say that because the rest of the spec has been redesigned to fit the new Eclipse. So now, whenever you're outside of Eclipse, it's actually not an annoying mistake, it's actually an intended part of the gameplay. A big part of that is Star-Lord, which now lasts much, much longer. So basically, you use it to build up a bunch of haste during your Eclipse, then you keep that haste and you use that haste to get resources ready for your next Eclipse. And there's actually even a talent that rewards you for leaving Eclipse with a low amount of astral power. And also, uptime is not a problem with this spec. You can have a total of 4 charges, and after you've made your way through those, you'll already have 2 of them back. And I'm kind of glad to say that it's absolutely a colossal improvement for the spec. But of course, you may have remembered that Eclipse was only one of Boomkin's problems. So let's get into the other things. Ramping into Eclipse with 2 casts was kind of annoying, but so too was needing to dot everything all of the time. And the major culprit for that was your mastery, where you got a huge amount of bonus damage whenever your dots were up. Now, of course, this really just meant that you were only tickling mobs whenever you didn't have all of your dots up, and that made killing short-lived mobs a gigantic pain in the ass, especially just doing normal things like questing. Now, the good news is they've reworked the mastery into Eclipse damage, and they've removed Astral Smolder, which basically means if you need to kill something quickly, you actually can this time. And that even goes for AoE with a new talent choice that speeds up your Starfall. So far, it's all been good, but that being said, there's a few things to keep an eye on, because it's only a half rework. They've kept some cool talents like Control of the Dream, but obviously, without weak ores to track the nuances there, it could be a bit of a nightmare to optimize around. But then, while there are some fun new talents, not all of them may end up being taken. It's basically, still a slightly awkward spec that's fairly easy to play wrong, but it absolutely does feel a lot better in Midnight. And most importantly, the Keeper of the Grove talent now lets you summon in a Dryad in combat, which, is pretty cool. So overall then, it's a half rework. There are still some issues, but the half that actually changed is brilliant, so I'm happy to say that this one is absolutely going down as a winner. Beast Mastery Hunter. For years, BM has been the turbo casual spec. It only had a few buttons and you were basically free as the wind to move. You kind of felt like you were a melee at ranged, but at the same time, it could actually be a pain to play properly. You needed weak auras to track Frenzy effectively, and up until the last rework, it was heavy in RNG to keep all 3 stacks up. That was a pain in the ass. Keeping uptime and Beast Cleave was a minor nuisance as well, and to top all that off, they had been adding more and more buttons on top of it that you kinda just used in a fire and forget fashion. So, with all of those problems, there was a lot that Blizzard could have done with Midnight. And they actually did a lot. As an example, multi-shot is now called Wild Thresh. It's a bit more flavorful and it now has a cooldown that matches Beast Cleave's duration, which essentially means keep it on cooldown and your Beast Cleave is sorted. As for the Frenzy stacks, well, those are completely gone. And all of those extra buttons that were just bolted on top of the spec, well, they're gone too. Loads of RNG reduction cooldown stuff has been culled as well, and that's been replaced by you actually managing your cooldowns and your focus in a more deliberate fashion. Even Dark Ranger and Pack Leader have got reworks. Yes, again, they've both had quite a few. Dark Ranger is now the RNG spec that adds procs and Wailing Arrow, and then Pack Leader has now got Stampede to basically make your cooldown windows way more of a spectacle. And ultimately, the sum of these changes is that it just feels like a much better version of BM, a more focused version of the spec. No awkward tracking, no proc vomit, basically just full send in your buttons and have some fun. Now, the pruning doesn't really stop with combat though, and this may be the dark side. Plenty of utility has been lost in the process, and that means your CC potential has been, I'd say, cut down from being quite over the top to maybe a bit more reasonable, which might be balanced across specs, but may not feel good if that's the kind of thing that you love. So, kinda sad, but at least Roar of Sacrifice is still here for hunters who want to be team players. And overall, the sum of the pruning, the reworks, and the changed hero talents is that Beast Mastery Hunter is absolutely a winner. Now, it doesn't have much depth to sink your teeth into, and it can have as few as 5 damage buttons to hammer, but honestly, being a hyper-complex thing is never really what this spec has been for lately, and I think for what it's trying to be, this seems like a really good incarnation of BM. Marksmanship Hunter. This one gets reworked all the time, and guess what? Blizzard are still not tired of reworking the damn thing, because after a complete overhaul less than a year ago, they're actually taking another stab at it, and this time you lose Streamline in its entirety, so no more stacking up your fast aim shots, because Blizzard, well, they want you to sit there and cast. The whole spec now revolves around slower aim shots and reducing their cooldown. Anything extra comes from using precise shots properly or fitting aim shots inside of Bulletstorm. And overall, it's a lot more simple to manage, but you do actually have to learn to plant your ass on the ground to do your aim shots. Well, your feet, but you get the point. The result is ultimately, I would say, a bit less interesting. And interesting can also mean weird, and in this case, that definitely does apply, because there are oddities here. I think Bulletstorm may end up as the real core of this spec, and to be honest with you, it's not the most clear ability to optimize your gameplay around. The same also goes for precise shots. Knowing your actual cast priority can be tough enough with so much cooldown reduction on your aim shots that it starts fighting for global cooldowns with precise shots, and then the unload capstone feels unintentionally rotation changing. So it is basically easier to understand, but echoes of the last few versions stick around and just make things feel a bit awkward. Now, there's another thing to rework, and that of course has been the hero talents, where even Sentinel has got another shot, where now, instead of summoning in an eagle, you summon in a Sentinel owl that just adds more damage. More importantly though, True Shot now lets you throw a real sick looking Moonlight Chakram. And as for Dark Ranger, well, you've got your Wailing Arrow back again. Maybe it'll stay around this time. Overall, what I would say is that MM is, I think, better by all of Blizzard's stated, goals and metrics, but I think it's just missing the rhythm of Streamline, and that does make it, well, a bit more boring to play, a bit more static to play. It might feel okay, given the other combat changes going on in the game, but where I'm sitting right now, it's a loser. It's not a huge loser, it is a little bit of a loser, though. Shadow Priests have been plagued by identity issues. Is it a dot class? Is it a regular caster? Is it a worshipper of the old gods? Or is it a void-loving Xal'atath simp? We've never really known, because the answer has kind of sort of been yes to all of those questions. So, this time round, to make it all fit into one box, Blizzard have basically just beaten it with a hammer. Let me show you what I mean. Devouring Plague and Shadow Crash have both got complete revamps in their fantasy, where they're now called Shadow Word Madness and Tentacle Slam. So that's one answer to our earlier questions. They very much are the old god flavor of Shadow Priest. Tentacle Slam will still apply dots, but it's way faster and it's on a lower cooldown. That answers our question of old god theme or Xal'atath simp theme, but it doesn't answer the question of whether they're a dot class or not. And the answer is they can be both. What I mean by that is this new talent choice. So basically, if you want to manually manage your dot uptime, you absolutely can. If you don't want to be bothered with that, well, the talent choice will allow you to do that. But then there's their other long-standing problem, and that is choosing how they do AoE damage. I mean, Psychic Link has basically been a plague in this spec for a long-ass time, and that's been because whenever your single target damage is also your AoE damage, it becomes extremely hard to balance. You would think Blizzard would have solved this problem, but seemingly, whenever that hammer swung down, it just missed this problem entirely. So, on the AoE front, you're basically just left hoping that they can get the damage tuning right. Though there may be a glimmer of hope. You see, having only one cooldown choice may help them out here. What I mean by that is the Dark Ascension is now gone, and that means that Shadow Priest is pretty much back to Void Form and Void Form extensions. Though, don't be too afraid though, because this time Blizzard have put in diminishing returns to just kind of put a cap on the absolute insanity that used to happen there. Put simply, Blizzard aren't hedging their bets anymore. They're not trying to make this a bit of every Void-related thing in the lore. It quite clearly is old god flavored. They have a clear vision for Shadow, and while it's not meant that they've went and solved the AoE issues, it does mean a lot of flavor, and a huge example of that is the Apex talent. You see, Ghosts and Tentacles are fully the theme here, and the Apex talent makes your Tentacle Slam spawn idle effects, like your litany of old god minions. Now, every idle effect will then spawn extra apparitions, which basically stack to more and more summons, which just leads you to having this miniature Black Empire army, which is honestly just awesome. It's really cool. And while because of that, the spec's now got way more purple boys, it also has fewer buttons. As an example, Halo is now exclusive to Arcane and Void Torrent to Void Weaver. Shadow Fiend exists, but now it's only there as a passive. And with Tentacle Slam effectively replacing Vampiric Touch, your Shadow Bar will certainly be looking a lot leaner in Midnight. And I'm happy to say that mostly is for the best. But I say mostly because the spec still can suffer from a mess of procs that are fighting with each other, especially when you're in the Archon hero talent with Halo's many effects firing off constantly. And Shattered Psyche is still here for some reason. I guess it just feels a bit vestigial. Now, beyond those issues though, and beyond some low-hanging fruit like tidying up the AoE that would be nice, I do actually have to say that Shadow is definitely a winner. That is both in terms of game feel, how it actually plays, and, extremely importantly, in fantasy. And that's because Tentacle Slam is a goddamn genius idea that is marvelously well implemented, just feels amazing. Fire Mage. Those of you who've been paying attention to the alpha have not had a great time. Fire Mage was the poster child victim of Midnight's pruning. Early videos and joke posts really set the tone for this one. Specifically, you guys were missing things like shifting power and Phoenix Flames, and that just completely deprived Fire Mage of its resources. Then, in losing Scorch, which is your execute and movement button, I mean, yous truly were just a laughingstock. We get that Blizzard wanted to prune, but with Fire, they had absolutely overshot. Just about everyone agreed. And as it turns out that everyone actually now includes Blizzard. That's because as of the latest beta build, Scorch is back in the rotation exactly where it was before. And that is a massive improvement compared to where this segment would have been. But there is still the question of, yeah, Scorch back is nice, but how does Fire actually end up? And the answer is that you're down your Phoenix Flames and your shifting power. In return, Fire Blast has more active cooldown reduction, and Combustion is down to a flat 1 minute cooldown. So in the end, very little about the core of this spec has changed. But what has actually changed is how it feels to play. And this is huge. and it's mostly down to Phoenix Flames, which were those extra on-demand crits, which of course were amazing to feed your hot streaks. That's gone, and even though you've got some extra fire blasts, you are just going to be throwing out less instant pyros. And that's even the case with Incombustion, which does not feel great. No one likes just standing there like a total gype hard casting a bunch of fireballs, feeling like a dick. But Blizzard obviously knows that. So what's going on? What's their plan? Well, they removed those buttons, but they have shifted some more power back into things, specifically back into Pyroblast. That means that you launch less of them, but you do feel each one a bit more. And on top of all that, they've done the Midnight Usual, which essentially is, like with other specs, removing tons of conditional buffs and auras to track. This is something they basically feel is vital because of the fundamental UI changes coming in this expansion. That means that Sun King's Blessing is gone, it's now replaced by the older, more simple version called Pyroclasm. Now, Feel the Burn has survived, but it's almost the only thing that you've got left to track. Even Frostfire has lost the mastery stacking mechanics, the ones that basically added 2 auras to watch out for. So now, it's almost entirely just the passive meteor boosting spec. That's basically the thing you'll be playing. But the question is all of that still enough to be fun? Honestly, you probably won't like the answer. And the straw that broke the camel's back here, it's just their movement options. The raw fun of Phoenix Flames is just gone. If you like that, too bad. But for most players, at least this pared back version with less to press and less to track will probably be an improvement, right? They'll probably hit their in-game goals a little bit more. It's certainly a fire mage that fits into Midnight, but it just does come in at a loss, I would say. And that's even before I count the loss of utility. Mass barrier is going away, their CC is being consolidated, and as if that isn't enough, both Mirror Image and Invisibility are losing their damage reduction. I can see how the changes make sense in line with Blizzard's design goals, but at least right now, I've got to call Fire a loser. Not as hard a loser as it would have been a week or two ago, but still a loser. Well, that's one mage spec down. Let's see how Frost fares. So, Frost was always framed to people as the simple, easy mage spec. But it's never really been like that, because simple probably shouldn't mean needing to know ideal spell travel distances and the travel times, understanding a whole bunch of undocumented interactions, and knowing exactly when damage events trigger. Knowing that you have to flurry immediately after a glacial spike to get free damage boosted crit without impacting your winter's chill stacks. You know, all that stuff that's not intuitive or explained by the game. So, Blizzard, with this rework, are basically here to fix all of those problems. So, let's see how they did. The first thing you'll notice is that Shatter is very, very different. Now, it's just a simple stack system. Almost every spell stacks the freezing debuff on enemies, and then Ice Lance shatters those debuffs to deal a whole bunch of damage. Basically, you pull up stacks, but of course never overcapping your stacks, and you just try to pop as many of those stacks as you can during windows of extra damage. Basically, there's no more arcane knowledge being needed of weird undocumented changes or the particular distance you've got to be from an enemy to optimize the travel time of a spell. It is just a more simple priority system. But Blizzard did come in with a mission of change, and they've changed a hell of a lot more than just that. As an example, Icy Veins. It's been your main cooldown since halfway through the Burning Crusade. Now it's gone. Yeah, it's literally gone, and you don't even have a traditional cooldown to replace it. That's because Ray of Frost takes its space, and Ray of Frost is just a whole big burst of damage and a lot of freezing stacks. Glacial Spike is still here, but it's no longer attached to your mastery, and it's actually no longer its own button. It's basically a thing that is on a timer, and whenever the timer's off, it will replace your next Frostbolt. So it's a little bit weird, but it's basically just Blizzard trying to consolidate your buttons without removing functionality. Then there's Comet Storm. It's actually quite similar. It crashes down after your Ray of Frost to shatter loads of stacks. And what I'd say is all of this leaves Frost feeling almost unrecognizable, except for having your water elemental back. And what all that means is that Frost shouldn't change all that much in practice. You're still throwing out most of the same spells, just not exactly in the same order. And not you, Shifting Power, you're gone. It's certainly much easier to understand and track now. It's also less punishing and less reliant on RNG. But it's also a bit less fun, because before, you knew when to press buttons because of your last or next button on your whole priority list, right? Doing your Glacial Spike, Flurry, Ice Lance, Ice Lance. that was fun. There was a rhythm to that people liked. Now, it's actually a lot messier because your eyes are instead glued to your target's freezing stacks. And ultimately that means it is a more approachable spec. And if that's Blizzard's main design goal, they've certainly hit it. But it's actually lost a lot of the sauce. It's lost a lot of the flavor that I think it had accrued over the years. And maybe a bunch of that flavor was a little unintuitive. But I think there could have been a way to preserve a whole bunch of it, and I don't think it's really been preserved. So there's that. But then on top of that, there's all of the utility that's being taken away. That does mean, for mages, well, you're now 2 out of 3 for losers. Let's see if that's going to be 3 out of 3. Arcane was always the perfect name for this spec, because it just has a long history of being arcane. Yes, literally arcane magic, but also arcane as in a bit weird and unknowable, and not just to players, because it has been reworked and reworked and reworked over the years, whilst the devs have been trying to get it to work the way they want it to. And most of the problem has been in the numbers for this spec. There are just so many modifiers and conditional buffs in Arcane's base spells that it was essentially a living nightmare to track and to figure out. So, Blizzard have decided to just come in and fix it for good. Which may certainly sound like a threat if you're an Arcane mage. What it means is that huge swaths of talents have been chucked out, and they've all been replaced with one buff to track. That buff is called Salvo. Now, it will stack from arcane missiles, and Barrage will spend it for absolutely huge damage. So your gameplay is watching Salvo build up, and then spending it at the right time. So there are fewer procs, and there are way fewer buffs. It is certainly more simple. Even Siphon Storm is dead, and Evocation is now just one of 2 ways to get your mana back. It certainly does sound a bit too simple, but Arcane is still Arcane. And certainly as I say this, I can almost feel the dread building up in any Arcane mages listening to this, thinking, oh god, our flavor is gone. Well, I am happy to say that Arcane is still Arcane. You still have got the classic tension that has always defined this spec, and that is, do you build charges and burn through your mana, or do you cycle charges and save up for your cooldowns? The good news is that gameplay, that mana management is actually still there. But this time, you have got 2 charges of Touch of the Magi, and deciding your next button is basically a whole lot easier. So, that's what's going on there. But that wasn't Arcane's only issue, and if you're a particularly sweaty player, then something you used to optimize seemingly will be going away. And what I mean there is that for years, you've had clipping, where basically you need to press Arcane Missiles, but Arcane Missile sucks, so you clip the cast at the right time to end it early. Basically, this is the sort of thing that would appear in the advanced tips section of a rotation guide, and I think in Midnight, Blizzard's war is really against the advanced tips section. I'm really serious. So instead of Salvo triggering whenever missiles is started, it triggers on each wave. So you can't clip it anymore. Blizzard seems to know what's up. Now another thing, and one of Arcane's oldest issues, was Arcane Explosion. It's pretty cool, you do just blow up. But there's a problem with that. You're a mage wearing cloth and you're standing in melee. And that could mean you just get killed. And now, many years later, someone at Blizzard has decided to try and fix this problem. They've done it in the form of Arcane Pulse, which is a targeted, casted version of that ability. It looks absolutely amazing, but sadly, does have a bit of a downside, and that is it's a pretty darn slow cast. So, Arcane Mage has lost some of its arcane nature. Arcane, by which I mean extremely complex. But there is actually still plenty of flavor left. Optimizing the Arcane Surge window is still precise, and your mana management is still important. It's still something you need to get a feel for, and that feel is core to you feeling a sense of mastery over the spec. I'm happy to say that is still there. And of the 3 specs, Arcane's the only one that wins going into Midnight. Even without Mass Barrier and some other utility lost along the way, it is just more fun. If I had to choose a mage spec to play, it would absolutely be Arcane, and that's just because the other 2, they've not entered this expansion well, and I desperately hope Blizzard takes a second look at Fire and Frost. Okay, Warlock time, and I'll start it with Affliction. You guys have had it rough. For years, you've essentially been stuck with an ability that you hate using. You know what it is. It's Malefic Rapture. It's been the bane of this spec since Shadowlands. That's why Blizzard have killed it. It's gone. So now, 3 expansions later, the Afflocks are free, and you're now back to burning all your shards on unstable Affliction, just like you did in the good old days. And that is not all that Blizzard removed. Oh no, Soul Rot, Phantom Singularity, and Vile Taint are now all gone. Yep, you'll have to go about without your Vile Taint. I'm very sorry. And that does mean that, you'll be manually dotting targets using Agony. And thinking about the spec in terms of abilities, there isn't really much left. The core of the spec looks almost old school. You keep Haunt and Agony rolling, and then you spam your shards on Unstable Affliction at the right time. Whenever you're out of shards, you just use your filler, and that filler doesn't even buff now that Shadow Embrace is gone. In AoE, you just get to spam your Seed of Corruption again. It's pretty old school feeling, right? But I will say it's not all old school. You see, Blizzard are doing some experiments to fix some ancient problems. By which I mean historically, an Affliction Warlock out of shards basically would have to twiddle their thumbs and wait an Agony or a mob death to give them some shards back. Well, that problem is now solved in the form of Dark Harvest. It's a new ability that refills your shards, and with the right hero talent, spending those shards in AoE will drop its cooldown massively, so you can then refill them again. It's actually a really satisfying little loop, but it does leave a question. What about single target? And I gotta level with you, it is a bit sleepy. Your shard generation can be painfully slow, and now there's kind of nothing to fill in the gaps. Blizzard's new love of simplicity means you just spend a lot of time casting filler instead of reacting to procs and to buffs, which isn't always fun. And in a single target boss, I think it really would be quite boring. Now, in most cases, the simplification has actually worked out. I just think with Affliction, it's certainly one of the worst afflicted, and especially in single target. Now, looking at this big picture, I'd say to many people, this actually will work out to be a net positive. And that basically is because you're finally losing Malefic Rapture. It's probably better baseline for continued development of the spec, which does mean that yes, I am going to put this down as a winner. It's not a massive winner, but it is actually a winner. Demonology then. You guys have had a pretty good run where over the last few expansions, Demonology has survived as one of the more complicated specs, and that's been thanks to Demonic Tyrant, Wild Imps, and the way that you can set all of that up. Some people love a long setup and a big payoff at the end. But Blizzard mustn't like foreplay, because goddamn they've changed things. Demo has been massively changed. Now if you just watched a character casting with the UI turned off, you may not notice much of a difference. But the second you turn the UI back on, you would see the difference. So, you now don't have a button for your Vile Fiend, and you only summon in one Felguard. You've got to pick between Power Siphon or Implosion, and Implosion will only work when you've got 6 Imps, so basically, you're not allowed to use it wrong. You'll also need 3 shards to cast your Hand of Gul'dan, your Dreadstalkers can always be free in instant, and Tyrant no longer snapshots to reward perfect play. In fact, unless you're playing Diabolist, Tyrant doesn't even buff demons. It only gets power from Imps and Dreadstalkers. So to put it simply, well, Demonology has been flattened. It's a lot harder to mess up when you're playing this, but in line with that, it's also way less satisfying to just drop the Tyrant on top of an absolute doom stack of demons that you have carefully set up. I think losing that amazing setup and payoff play is just a shame. Now, visually, it should look just as good. It's more that that sort of thing won't impact the damage meter as drastically as it used to. So for many people, the visual fantasy will still be there and they'll love it. But I think for people who loved the visual fantasy being matched with the numbers going up hugely, well, they maybe won't enjoy this as much. But in terms of changes, that's only the start. Most of the talent tree has been quietly replaced, but like with many other classes, it's just Blizzard swapping out untracked buffs and modifiers that take away from your base damage output. And unusually, Demonology is actually getting some new abilities. Yeah, it's not the norm for this expansion. So the passive Doomguard is now becoming a cooldown that you press, and there's a new set of Grimoire demons. You've got the Imp Lord and the Fell Ravager, which are upgraded versions of your normal Warlock pets, and they do include their respective abilities. Now, it may not work in practice because of the damage loss, but at least with them, you would be able to bring a spare Dispel or Interrupt. So ultimately, that will mean, for the average player who just wants Demo to look as cool as it always did, but just find more success with it, those people are probably going to be real happy, and it will for them be a huge winner. But, well, for the people who loved playing the absolute top end of this, I think this is going to be a loser. Management is still important. It's still something. We're now at the final Warlock spec, Destruction. And you know what? It's almost the least changed spec in the whole game going into Midnight. And you know what? That's great news. Now, it's a bit funny that I say that, whilst the patch notes still look like this. It's pretty huge, right? Now, I wouldn't be overly worried. You see, it's huge because Blizzard have taken the scalpel to modifiers and conditional buffs. This is all part of their attempt to basically just make your abilities be your abilities and not rely on a million other things to do real damage. So talents like Rolling Havoc, Ritual of Ruin, and Eradication, the sorts of talents that made damage calculations more complicated, the stuff that you have to play around but that wasn't fun or easy to track, well, that's just kind of going away. Then there's Soulfire, which is hugely changed. It no longer procs a shorter cast time. So basically, if you want to send one of those, you've got to commit to it, but it's been buffed like crazy, so the damage will actually feel worth it. Now, there's also a little bit of competition on that node because Dimensional Rift is located over here. Now, these are all kind of tiny scalpel level changes, but they are ones that solve the minor problems that Destro locks consistently had to worry about. They've even been given Rain of Fire spam back as a bit of a treat, though not quite as game-breaking as the last iteration of that. RIP, it was fun while it lasted. But Blizzard, I think, realized that Destro actually needed a little bit more. So naturally, they've added in something called Lake of Fire. Sounds awesome. I think we can all get behind a lovely Lake of Fire, but in practice, well, doesn't everyone just love static damage pulls that tanks can immediately pull mobs away from and make you feel sad because you'll just lose a bunch of AoE damage? So it's a pretty dope ability, but in practice, it could be a little frustrating because of mob movement. Overall then, I'll say this. Destro is not a loser. It is a winner, but it's a minor winner. That is, unless you're someone who loves having more excuses to scream at your tank and call them nasty names. Because if that is you, then this may be the best change you've ever got. Elemental Shaman. So it's a spec that's always had more ideas than it could really fit comfortably. It cast spells of every type, it summoned in minions, and to top it all off, you had a whole bunch of totems you could drop. Well, with Midnight, Blizzard are finally feeling willing to get rid of stuff, but they haven't really done it in a, I'd say, silly way, like they may have done with some of the mage stuff. Here, it actually seems they've been able to thread the needle and be real smart about it. So on paper, Ellie loses a lot and maybe should lose a lot, but they've been real smart. Now, some things are totally gone. Those are your Ice Fury, Elemental Equilibrium, and Echoes of Great Sundering. They are just completely gone. But as I go through the other changes, you'll see there's a lot of smart consolidation. So elementals lose their own summon buttons. They're not a thing that you cast, but they've been rolled into Stormkeeper and Ascendants instead, and even their primal versions have survived. Primordial Wave is gone, but in its place you've got Voltaic Blaze, which is similar but also spreads Flame Shock for drastically easier AoE. Now, that existing kind of makes your Liquid Magma Totem feel irrelevant, so Blizzard chucked that in the bin as well. So what you basically see, and what's left of Elemental, is a leaner version of itself, and a version absolutely with way fewer buttons to press. But I would say, without actually losing much of value. Now, your Master of Elements and Elemental Blast are still there, so managing your resources in your cast order is still an important thing, and I'm so glad they've kept that, unlike, say, some of the mage changes. But Blizzard have done this in a way where the buffs are now more cleanly consolidated. So what this basically means, right, is just a bunch of scalpeling. Minor changes, a lot of pruning though, but it's actually taken this over the line from being frustrating to fun, and that means I'm happy to say it's a goddamn winner. Augmentation Evoker is absolutely still the red-headed stepchild of WoW. It's a bit different, and only a handful of people like it. Now, some like it for being a support they don't feel too stressed on, but for others, well, they like it because it can be a genuinely advanced spec to optimize, especially in raids where the current iteration needs you standing beside the players that you want to buff. Well, Blizzard thinks that bit is certainly a bit mad, so cue a handful of changes to target that one issue, mainly in the form of Ebb and Might, because it now buffs every DPS in the raid instead of just a few. Though for that to work, it basically splits the buff with each new target, and that means no more weird positioning, but also it means no more optimizing your buff, right? It's just a thing that goes in everyone. It's a bit more simple. To some people that's good, to some they'll have lost some fun. Now another simplification is blistering scales, where instead of working like Earth Shield with charges, it can now work like an upgraded Earth Shield, which is actually permanent, and that means no upkeep required. Now, there are a few other minor tweaks to make life a bit easier, but really, that's kind of it. Essentially, a simplification to ensure the dungeon and raid have got the same actual support gameplay. Now, I am sure that's going to disappoint a few people, but, well, I've got worse news to tide you over, and that is that Rescue is losing its defensive component because Blizzard basically just wants it to be a movement thing only. So that definitely is a loss, but on account of the other things, and I think the functional problem that they will solve for plenty of players, I think Augmentation Evoker is a tiny winner. Tiny winner, though. Devastation Evoker. It's a bit weird, and it never quite got over having a 25-yard range, though, hey, at least with a new Demon Hunter, it will have some company in the mid-range. But even with that, it still was able to find plenty of fans. And in this expansion, Blizzard have pruned it, but they've done so in a way that has actually kept most of what people liked intact. Though I do have to say most because there is a pretty darn hefty hero talent rework here. Now, I'll start with what things are staying. Shattered Star and Firestorm are still alive, but they're not living on in the form of being their own buttons. That's because the star will now come from Eternity Surge for free, but that means it loses its insanely tight 4-second damage window, so a bit more simple. Firestorm will also stay, but only as a part of Feed the Flames. Then there's Living Flame, which gets a hefty upgrade this expansion. You now can take the cast time and the dot talents at the same time instead of having to choose between them. So basically, right, that's the main changes. Essentially everything about Devastation is changing, but that is until we get to the Flame Shaper hero talent. So, Engulf is gone entirely, and anything that buffed it now buffs your Fire Breath directly instead. And to help you forget its loss, they've actually now got a second charge of Fire Breath, and you'll certainly need it, and that's because the Flame Shaper capstone now lets Disintegrate and Pyre burn through the dot that it applies much faster than Engulf ever could. And Blizzard actually sweetened the deal with one last change, and it's literally just one for the Devastation sickos out there, where Dragon Rage extensions are back to being uncapped. Now, it's harder to extend, but the Apex talent greatly rewards you for keeping it up to 30 seconds. So that's Blizzard giving you some gameplay back, which actually is a big winner. And honestly, overall, this one is a winner. That being said, their compatriot in 25-yard range is entirely missing from this video. And that's because it's not getting any changes. That's because it's a new spec. And if you want to know all about the new Devourer spec, which honestly, I may even main going into this expansion, then check out our video on it, which is over here. If it is you, then this may be the best change you've ever got.